a tall, quiet man who always had a serious look on his face. Bud Moore is a decorated war veteran who is one of the originals in NASCAR racing. A highly skilled mechanic, he found success as the sport grew. Today, on Men Behind the Wrenches, we take a look at the legendary mechanic and car owner, Bud Moore. For over 6 decades, Bud Moore has been a fixture on the NASCAR circuit. The sport's greatest drivers and mechanics have passed through his garage. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff Hammond and welcome to Men Behind the Wrenches. Moore was part of the sport's old guard, a no-frills guy who used his wrench to do his talking. Bud transformed his mechanical achievements into a successful race team. Raised on a farm in Spartanburg, South Carolina, Bud tinkered with his dad's farm tractors and Model Ts as a youth. During his teen years, World War II raged in Europe. At 18, he was drafted into the United States Army, where he found himself a part of the D-Day invasion.
I went in the Army in August of '43, and I came out in November of 1945, and I left my basic training after 13 weeks. They sent me to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and I joined the 90th Infantry Division. They shipped us overseas, and our regiment was attached to the 4th Infantry Division, made the assault on the Utah beach on June the 6th. So I hit the beach 5 o'clock in the morning on D-Day, went all the way across Germany. I got wounded several times. I wound up with 5 Purple Hearts and 2 Bronze Stars. When I got to Le Havre, France in November 1st or 2nd of 1945, they were sending me back home for a discharge. When I got on to get on that boat, I said to myself, and I raised up and looked at the good Lord, and I said, Lord, just let me get back home. I won't be back. And I've had a lot of good invitations, but I never went back yet.
Bud returned home a highly decorated soldier. Upon his arrival, he and a friend, Joe Eubanks, began buying and selling used cars. One day, they and another buddy, Cotton Owens, acquired a '39 Ford modified stock car in one of their trades and decided to race.
We went up to the Ruffin County Fairgrounds, and I tried to drive it, and I couldn't drive it. I tied a fence down. So Cotton got in that car that day, and I think he run about 2nd or 3rd in the heat race and run 4th or 5th in the feature. And we had our car, and then Joe said, well, maybe I ought to drive. So he started driving, and Joe turned out to be a real good race driver.
By 1947, Moore was hooked on racing and opened a garage to work on race cars.
Well, we started out mostly doing it for fun, but when you run 3 races a week, and back then, you know, if you took in $200, $250 on a weekend, that was like probably taking in $10,000 now, you know.
Eubanks and Moore ran modifieds and stock cars all around South Carolina through 1955. By 1957, Bud worked on cars for others, including Speedy Thompson and Buck Baker.
Buck Baker was a heck of a race driver. He was one of the best that came along back in the 50s, late 40s and 50s, on up into the 60s. And I really enjoyed working with Buck Baker, and I remember the first race that we ran, we won, and we won several races in 57 with Baker. I don't remember now how many, but we ran a lot of races. But we won a lot of them too.
That year, Baker won the 1957 Grand National Championship in a car built by Moore.
Well, I was really the crew chief and chief mechanic and all on the car that Buck Baker drove. And Baker was really the car owner and the driver, you know, as far as the 57 championship was concerned.
Bud had found his calling as a champion crew chief, but there was much more. By 1960, Bud had been building cars for Baker and Jack Smith. In July of '60, Smith would set a world record of 146.842 miles an hour for a 250-mile race at Daytona. The race was also notorious for being one of the first to use a driver-to-crew chief two-way radio, one of the many innovations Bud was soon known for. Later that year, Bud was approached with an opportunity he couldn't turn down.
At the end of the year, Ray Nichols came to me and says, why don't you form your own race team and be the car owner and the whole deal. So I went to Pontiac and...
Now running his own team, Bud needed a driver. He chose Joe Weatherly.
Weatherly, when it sat down in that race car, he meant business. and he ran that car just as hard as it could run for the whole length of the race, whether it was 100 mile or 200 mile or whatever it might be we were running. And this is what made him so good.
That was the start of a unique relationship between Bud and Joe.
I think Bud recognized talent, you know, when you put him in the driver's seat. And he wanted, Bud wanted someone who could go fast, but also wanted someone who could take care of the equipment and make sure that the car lasted. And Joe was that kind of driver.
When he got Bud's ride, he was certainly happy. I personally never heard him say, "This is the best break I ever had," but I think it probably was.
Weatherly was a fierce, fierce competitor. And of course, Bud Moore's a very tough character, driven to win too. He didn't get all those Purple Hearts in World War II in Normandy, and then later on into Germany by being a faint of heart.
Joe was a very, very likable person, and everybody at the racetracks loved him. And Bob Cobbin used to call him his son, you know, and he was the man on Darlington, and he called him my little kinky-headed son, you know.
In 1962, Moore and Weatherly combined to win 9 times in 52 races and beat Richard Petty by over 2,000 points for their first NASCAR Grand National Championship.
It was a good combination that year between all of our, you know, back then, like I say, we had what our pit crew was made out of Sunday Warriors, you know, we call them Sunday Warriors, and this stuff because they went to the races just to be going because we couldn't afford to pay them. It was a good deal for as Pontiac Motor Company was concerned to win the championship in the Pontiac because it never had been done before, and this is what made it so great.
I still don't think that history will probably realize what a good driver he was, what a champion he was, in the sense that he only probably ran, I don't think championship was in Joe's mind for many years, for any years before he associated with Bud, but it was for Bud. I mean, Bud understood that, hey, these things may be worth winning. Races were really more the driving force. Winning races meant more to those guys in those years than the championship, which didn't pay as much. And as far as they were concerned, that was bonus money.
Bud had seen championship success as a mechanic and a car owner, but he wasn't done writing racing history yet. With the lack of factory backing, 1963 would be a challenging year for Bud and driver Joe Weatherly. Pontiac,
they pulled their support and said they was getting out and this stuff, and then Dick McCain came along with, he was the head man with Lincoln and Mercury. And he came to me and talked to me about running the Mercury for 1964. And I said, well, you know, why don't we just figure on running a race at Darlington? And that's getting close to the last race of the season in the Southern 500 with a Mercury. And so we start working on with the Mercury and all and be ready for 1964. So we thought that was a great idea. So we run the last few races of 1963 with a Mercury. Now with the support of Mercury, it made it easier for Bud to focus on the big picture of racing. Racing back then was sort of a sideline for everybody, and we sort of worked a lot at nights on the race cars, and we worked on private cars and stuff in the daytime to make a living. When the motor car company started paying the bills and this stuff, you know, then it sort of let the outside work sort of move about, and then you started working on the race team and the race car all by itself. Weatherly adapted the brand change and charged toward his second consecutive title. This time he beat Fred Lorenzen, driving various cars with Bud Moore's Mercury as the backbone to his championship run. The 63 Pontiac was competitive all the way up till the time we quit running it. But then when we got with the Mercury, there was a lot of things about the Mercury we liked a little better than we did the Pontiac, and there were some things Pontiac had that was a little bit better than the Mercury. But we took the combination of the two and we worked out some of the bugs that we'd had in one and put in the other one and vice versa, and that's what made Mercury a real good race car. Early the next season, the Weatherly Moore team would end tragically at the first race in Riverside. We built 64 model Mercury Marauders to run in 1964. We go to Riverside, California, and what happened, we sent the car out to Bill Stropp's about a couple of weeks prior to the race because Ford Motor Company came out with some new brakes. And you know, running Riverside, you had to have the very best brakes you could get. So they wanted me to take the car out, Lincoln and Mercury Division, and I sent the car out to California a couple of weeks early, and they took it out to Strop, and they put on all new brakes, something or other that they had came up with, and it was some good stuff. And this is what happened, and when we got into the race, we hadn't run but maybe 3 or 4 laps, and Joe had lost second gear in the transmission. So we come in the pits, and about that time they had a big pileup on the front straightaway. I don't know, 30 or 40 cars, and meantime Joe jumped out and said, put a transmission in, put a transmission in. And I said, Joe, we're going to put it. So we jacked the car up and we put a new transmission in. Well, back then they didn't have a rule like you couldn't work on it on the red flag, so the race was red flag, and was stopped, and to clean that mess up. And we put a transmission in the car. And Joe got back out, and we was only 1 lap down when they restarted the race. And it took us about 15 minutes to put a transmission in. So anyway, we was running during the race, and Joe was running real hard, and we was running as fast as the lead cars, but the only thing about it was Joe he already knew he was a lap down, and I guess he had the idea he was going to try to make that lap up. And he wore the brakes out pretty bad, and one of the adjusters on the right front, where they had these automatic adjusters on them, adjust the brakes while the car ran, and the adjuster fell out, and when it did, it blew the wheel cylinder, and he lost the brakes going into turn 5, and he had to make a left-hander into 5 and then make a hard right-hander into 6. When he did, the car got airborne and got into the wall. And Joe didn't wear no safety. He didn't wear a shoulder harness, and he didn't like shoulder harness. He just wore a safety belt, and his body sort of went outside the car, and that's when we lost him. And when we got back home, I just about quit racing over it. I told my wife and talked about it and all this, you know. And so anyway, we decided then that we'd continue.
Bud put Billy Wade in the car and found more success.
Ford had came out with the overhead valve engine, and for Ford, and they wanted to get it okayed, and France wouldn't okay it, so they boycotted the races, and they started not running. And France came to me and said, look, we got to have some cars, and we just can't be running Plymouth and this stuff. Says, we got to have some competition with them guys, and we got to run all these races and stuff. So I agreed with him that I'd run for him. So we started running all the races with 2 cars, and this was 65. One feat we had in 65 was with Billy Wade. This is when they run what they call the Northern Tour. So we won all 4 races in a row at Northern Tour, and it's never been done before.
Sadly, an accident would claim Wade's life a year later. But Moore persevered, and his role in race car development was about to make a major impact on the entire sport of auto racing. As the 60s concluded, Bud was running a limited NASCAR schedule while helping Ford on the Grand American and Trans Am circuits. With Tiny Lund behind the wheel, Bud found more championship success.
We started the Trans Am Series for Ford Motor Company in 1969. We had Parnella Jones and George Foreman running for us. And we won, they had 11 races to run in 69. We won 6, I believe it was, out of 11, and Mark Donahue and Penske won the other 5, but they had 1 second place better than we were, and they won the championship in 1969. So in 1970, we won, I believe it was 9 out of the 11 races in 1970, and we won the championship, so it was a good year for us.
His work with the Trans Am Series led to Bud's development of the small block engines for Ford. In 1972, when Bud returned full-time to Winston Cup racing, it was with a 72 Ford, a 351 Cleveland engine, and David Pearson in the driver's seat. The small block engine program had come to life.
I got with Pearson. We built a 72-mile Torino Ford to run the small block in, and so we hired Pearson to drive the car, and we went to Atlanta with the car, and David qualified 2nd or 3rd, and we ran 4th in the race in Atlanta.
His cars were powerful. leaving the competition to look for the secrets of his horsepower.
Well, you know, that was one thing, you know, is what I always figured and we tried to do was have usable horsepower. In other words, you could have a lot of horsepower and no torque, and the car still didn't run too good. So we worked on torque on the engine to get power down low at low RPMs and hold the power all the way up through a certain RPMs, and this is how we worked at it.
By 1978, Bud was once again looking for a driver. For the past few years, Buddy Baker had piloted his race cars, but Buddy was on the move. Bud decided to take a chance on Bobby Allison, who was coming back from injuries. The duo headed to Speed Weeks. His gamble on Allison would pay off in big ways.
At Daytona, the car was good. The car drove good. The car was pretty fast. And I was doing really, really good in the qualifying race, which was rained out Thursday, and so we were running Friday morning. Buddy Baker slid in some oil and plowed into me and tore that car all to pieces. And I went to the motel. I laid there in the motel thinking about this thing and stewing about it, and said, you know, my career is over. I need to just go tell Bud that I'm quitting. So Saturday afternoon, went back to Daytona Speedway and walked into the garage area to tell Bud that I was going to Alabama, and looked, and they had repaired that car, and it looked so good sitting there. I mean, and it just showed so much effort. And you know, several of those guys has really worked hard on that thing, and I said, wow. So those guys can work that hard for me, I'll give them one more day best I can. And so I won the Daytona 500 the next day.
Buddy Baker came to me and he said, damn, and I just got out of that car and got in this one, you come and win the Daytona 500.
Bobby and Bud would stay together through 1979. The next man to climb behind the wheel of a Bud Moore car would soon be a legend. During the 80s, Benny Parsons, Ricky Rudd, Brett Bodine, and Dale Earnhardt piloted Bud Moore machines. It was during his stint with Bud that Earnhardt matured as a driver and honed his intimidating image.
I really enjoyed Dale. Dale was a little hard on the equipment and this stuff because he wanted to lead every lap he could, and we should have won a couple of championships with Dale, and we should have won a lot more races. But one problem we had was in the engine. We had valve springs that wouldn't stand it. And like I told Dale, I said, now, you know, you sort of got to take it easy for the first 100, 150 miles, because them valve springs are only going to last about 350, 400 miles. But he just, you know, when he got out front, he ran. And out of all the races he ever drove for me, there wasn't one race that I can ever remember that we wasn't out front when we blew up or something.
By 1999, economics caught up with Bud and forced him to make the tough decision to retire from the sport he helped nurture from the start.
We were still looking for enough sponsorship to run and be competitive, and when we didn't find it, after about 2 years, that's when the Finleys came along and they wanted to buy a race team, and we sold out. 1999. I don't go to the races now. One reason, because I don't know. I just if I had a car running, I'd go. Still, I miss it all. I miss it. I still miss it. I sure do.
By the time of his retirement, 35 drivers had driven a Bud Moore Engineering stock car. They had won 63 times in 924 races, with 43 poles over 6 decades. Bud's place in history was cemented forever.
Bud Moore, another very hard-working individual, very dedicated to his sport, and not the greatest diplomat in the world, but one of the hardest working people that you've ever seen. Always built good, fast race cars, and I always looked at him as maybe having some of the safest race cars, because he would go to the limits to try to make his cars as safe as possible.
He just had that knowledge, and he always had good people with him, and yeah, it was a delight. Let me tell you, but boy, oh boy, did he have a temper. Whew. Get him mad, don't go to the race shop.
But yet he was, and still is, one of the nicest guys I've ever been in contact with. I would say he's helped as many people as would let him, because he was always concerned about whether you had what you needed.
I can tell you where NASCAR history should place Bud Moore, and that's right up in the top of the list, unquestionably. As both a mechanic and as a team owner and as a team organizer, surely he's one of the top 5 of all time.
Bud Moore was always one of those special people that, let's do it, let's do this job, let's do the job as best we can, let's do it properly, and let's be satisfied with our effort. You know, let's give it our best effort, but then we'll take what we get.
Bud was smart. He built great engines. He was certainly one of the best engine builders of the time. He had great teams, and he made a big crossover into Trans Am racing and road racing, which I thought was personally one of his signal achievements.
I really think that NASCAR is one of the greatest in the world right now, and the racing, as far as racing is concerned, it can't be beat. And it's the most competitive sport in the world. And that's why we got so many fans and all with TV and all this, because when they drop that green flag, you know, it's not put on. It's everybody for himself.
Bud Moore is a true throwback to the early days of racing. The innovations introduced by Moore through the years can still be seen in the Winston Cup garages today, while the mechanics and the drivers that pass through his organization continue to exemplify the work ethics he instilled. For the men behind the wrenches, I'm Jeff Hammond. Thanks for joining us.